That really what China wants is, let's get rid of these old vestiges of post-World War II security order in Asia. Instead, let's have Asia defend Asians. But the message is clear what they mean, that this is China's world now.
That's just part of the conversation you'll hear in just a moment. From Asia News Weekly, you're listening to Asia Now, a collection of stories and interviews from the Asia Pacific region. You can download all of our programs on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. And if you enjoy this episode, I hope that you'll share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Regional stability is a prominent topic in Asia. China is often seen as a bully towards many ASEAN members. Is China following in the footsteps of Japan some 70 years ago? It's just one conversation taking place in Asia now. Welcome to Asia Now. I'm Steve Miller. While preparing for the July 18th edition of Asia News Weekly, I stumbled upon an interesting opinion piece entitled, "Is New China the Old Japan?" It was a fairly interesting read, and with the developments in the region last week, I knew I wanted its author on the show. I reached out to Curtis S. Chin last week, and if you listened to that episode of Asia News Weekly, you heard a portion from our discussion. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Curtis S. Chin to Asia Now.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be with you today.
Before we get into today's conversation, could you give a little bit of a background story to yourself?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. I think most recently people know me in Asia. I've been in and out of Asia for so many years. I'm an Asian American. You don't see me on your podcast, but I blend well quite in here. But people know me mainly because of my role most recently on the board of directors of the Asian Development Bank. There I served as a U.S. ambassador to the ADB, which basically meant I represented the United States on the board, pushing for greater transparency, greater effectiveness of the range of infrastructure and development projects across Asia that the ADB finances. It's really sort of an Asian version of the World Bank. But more recently, I was honored to have been named the first Asia Fellow of a group called the Milken Institute out of California. So the Milken Institute has set up shop in Singapore, and we're busy working towards our very first Asia Summit, which will take place this September 19th in Singapore. So my background is a mix of government, banking, and also pretty much a decade and a half or so career with a major public affairs communications firm called Burson Marsteller, which is part of a bigger empire known as WPP Group. But in and out of Asia for some 2 decades now.
Now, the reason why we're speaking today is you wrote a very interesting article just a short time ago, and you hypothesized that the China of today really draws a lot of similarities to Japan in the first part of the 20th century. I was wondering how you developed that hypothesis.
It's interesting. I travel across Asia, whether in China or, I spend a lot of time right now in Southeast Asia, and the Milken Institute, again, is based in Singapore. But I think just look at the headlines today. China is rising, which actually I think is something that should be welcomed. But I think as in 70, 80 years ago, almost roles have changed. 70, 80 years ago, people worried about, adjusted to the rise of Japan. Look at today, we see the rise of China. And so what I am saying is that can be a good thing. But I think all of us need to be wary, including China, that China's rise, both economically and militarily, doesn't unintentionally lead us all down to the path of conflict and indeed armed conflict.
Now, in your article, you mentioned that China is expanding its territory by force and not necessarily by diplomacy. And I was wondering, in your opinion, or in speculative terms, why do you think that they're doing it, and why there isn't that much resistance?
Well, I think there is resistance, but again, how do you resist if you're up against a giant?
Well, that's what we're seeing with Vietnam. Their fishing boats just aren't any match, and their Coast Guard ships aren't any match for the cutters that are out there in the territorial waters.
I had the honor to serve for 2 years under President Obama, 2 years under President Bush as a part of the U.S. Treasury Department International Affairs team. But I have to say that, since stepping down from U.S. government, my view is that the U.S. is increasingly seen as unengaged, despite all the rhetoric of the pivot to Asia. And I think that's one factor into what we're seeing today. I think China is testing the region, not just the United States, but testing how countries will respond to China is what some people say is I don't want to say by force, but it's by a step-by-step salami slice of territory at a time rise in Asia. So I think there has to be a connection, indirect or direct, between the United States' perceived weaknesses and China's increasing assertiveness.
No, I agree with that. I mean, we take a look at, was it last November when they unveiled the 9-dash line that essentially took all of the China Sea as their own. And they also really increased their, I guess, confrontational nature in several areas, specifically with Vietnam, with the deployment of the oil rig, which has now since come back or in the process of being removed, the Philippines with reclamation of land, and with significant flybys and interaction with Japan over the Senkaku Daio disputed areas. I was wondering, do you see one particular area that's more of a flashpoint than others?
Well, clearly what we've seen is really the South China Seas and also the East China Sea. But I'd say the South China Sea right now more than the East China Sea, quite frankly, because the nations of the South China Sea are perceived perhaps as a little bit less strong than the nations of the East China Sea. So East China Sea, we're really talking about, let's say, Japan and Korea. South China Sea, we're talking about the Philippines, we're talking about Vietnam, so countries that don't necessarily have the strength of a Japan or of even a Korea to stand up against what some perceive again as China's increased assertiveness. That 9-dash line, has been around a while. If you look at old maps from a decade or so ago, you'll see China's dash line asserting really that it has, I don't say the rights, but that it is its own, much of the South China Sea. But what we're seeing now, a stronger China is better able to assert what it has long maintained, what is part of its own, geographic kind of remit.
Overall, many countries don't support China's claim. Do you think that they'll have to back down, or China will come to the middle in some way?
I think the reality is that money talks and force talks. Back down, is, for Asia, it sounds like then someone is losing face. I think China, if it's smart, if the region is smart, all nations will come together and find some kind of face-saving way forward to avoid conflict. But I think China has been very clear that it's not afraid of conflict, even armed conflict, when it feels people are threatening its sovereignty. There was a really interesting bunch of data that came out, I think this past Monday, by Pew Research Center, which is a very respected kind of polling company out of the U.S. So it looked at concerns over China's territorial ambitions in Asia and what Asians thought of China versus the U.S. So, I just pulled up the data before we got on, and I noted that, it varies so much from, here. I happen to be in Thailand today, where it's pretty evenly split, but it's pretty even. That Thai people, 72% of Thai people, have a favorable view of China, and 73% of Thai people have a favorable view of the United States. So very balanced. But then you look at the nations that are having increasing amounts of conflict between the U.S., and you see what is playing out is that there have been consequences on China's image with regards to its recent assertiveness. So, for example, in Japan, 7% of Japanese people, incredibly low number, have a favorable view of China, while 66% of Japanese have a favorable view of the U.S. In Vietnam, 16% favorable view of China compared to 76% a favorable view of the United States. So we see these numbers across the region. So there are consequences, of course, to China's actions, but the question will be, does China really care when what it wants, again, is territory? It wants the right to be able to develop, first explore for oil and gas and other natural resources in the region. So I think what we're seeing right now is that countries are having to think through, how do they deal with China's rise? And China has to also think through, how does it kind of position its rise in the region? I was struck after I wrote the first version of the opinion piece that we're talking about today, is New China the same as old Japan. I was struck on a visit to a fascinating small exhibition in New York City at a place called the Grolier Club, which focuses on like books and prints from the past. They did an exhibition of really wartime propaganda. And there was a small poster. It was during the time of the Japanese kind of occupation of the Philippines. And that poster said, Asia for Asiatics. So kind of implying that what Japan was doing in World War II was simply defending Asia, throwing out the Western colonial powers. And so that's, again, it struck me when I heard some of the rhetoric coming out of China. That really what China wants is, let's get rid of these old vestiges of post-World War II security order in Asia. Instead, let's have Asia defend Asians. But the message is clear what they mean, that this is China's world now.
Oh, exactly. And you're referring to the statements that Chinese President Xi Jinping unveiled the Asian security concept recently. One more question. Japan is currently going through the motions in the Diet right now to approve the reinterpretation of Article 9 for collective self-defense. Do you think that Japan's increased presence in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, will have an impact on China's stance over the Nine-Dash Line?
I think each nation is certainly almost like feeling out the other on what can be done. Prime Minister Abe, to his great credit, I was just in Tokyo. I feel that there's a change in the psychology of Japan, having been through, a decade plus of what was economic stagnation. I speak a lot to corporations and around the world. Everyone asks about China. It wasn't until Prime Minister Abe showed up that people also began to ask about, well, what's up with Japan these days? It's, despite having been the second largest economy in the world and now third after China, it's like people have forgotten about Japan, which is really unfortunate. I think Japan and China both can play very constructive roles in the region, helping, the neighboring nations build peaceful prosperity is my hope. And so, again, each of these nations, China and Japan, are trying to feel out each other and also to be, in some ways, fighting for the allegiances of other nations in the region. But here again, money talks. And so is it through aid, through my own world of infrastructure, finance, and development? Is that now how China will seek to win the battle? A great, I think, a positive development, but we'll see how it plays out in the last few days, has been the announcement of progress forward on something called the BRICS Bank. The BRICS is shorthand for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa. And they, at their most recent summit, announced progress towards creating really a new infrastructure financier, a new infrastructure development bank, with clearly China playing the lead role. And will China use that bank and another bank they proposed, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, as a way also to buy allegiances, which some people, to be honest, have accused Japan of doing through its prominent role at the Asian Development Bank?
Oh, absolutely. And as you said, it's all about the money. We see that so many times in so many conflicts around the world.
Indeed.
Curtis Shen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Great pleasure to be with you today.
I'd like to thank Curtis S. Chin again for joining me this week. Links to the article as well as Mr. Chin's contact information will be included in the show notes over at AsianNewsWeekly.net. I'd also like to thank you for listening today. And if you know of someone who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. Don't forget you can also subscribe to all of our shows in iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. Before I sign off, I'd love to hear from you. Do you think China is marching down the road of becoming the Japan of so many years ago? Please leave your answer on our page, our Facebook wall, or you can reply via Twitter. You can also send an email to podcast@AsianNewsWeekly.net. Again, thank you so much for listening. For Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller. Asia Now is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.